G'day, Dave here, and we're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 13 through to 18. Looking at the topic of wisdom, and 3 points. Firstly, the reality of wisdom. Secondly, the priority of wisdom. And thirdly, the opportunity for wisdom. So look at each in turn. Verse 13. I also saw under the sun this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built a huge siege works against it. Now there lived in that city a man, poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. But nobody remembered that poor man. And here is a guy, he's poor, he's not got much to show for himself, but he is wise. And when the city is surrounded by this powerful force that they can't possibly, by military force, overthrow, the wisdom of this poor man wins through, and the city is saved. It wasn't his wealth, it wasn't his status, it wasn't his position, it wasn't his power, it wasn't the strength of an army. No, it was wisdom. But sadly, he's no longer remembered. So the reality of wisdom, it can be very significant. Secondly, the priority of wisdom. In Ecclesiastes, we often get contrast. This is better than that, and we'll see it again here. Verse 16. So I said, wisdom is better than strength, but the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are no longer heeded. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Mate, here is the reality of the quiet, wise word having more influence, being more important than the shouts of a ruler of fools. I'm sure it resonates with us, but lest our thoughts go too quickly to the land of politics, the reality is we need to look at our own hearts. Quiet wisdom is more important than the shouting of fools. And I confess that there are times when I speak before I think, when I don't apply wisdom to the words and I get caught up in the emotion and I'm speaking loudly and I'm passionate about something. It might be a situation of conflict, and I look back later, sadly, I've just spoken foolishly and I've done damage to the relationship, and much better would be a quiet word of the wise. And you know what? Quiet words are more likely to be heeded than yelling and carrying on. Well, so we've got the reality of wisdom, we've got the priority of wisdom. What about the opportunity for wisdom? How can we apply wisdom? How can we get wisdom in the first place? Well, James chapter 1 and verse 5 says that if any of you lacks wisdom, you should pray for it, and God who gives generously will give you wisdom. So here's a start. Fall on your knees, come before God, and ask for his wisdom. Ask God to fill you with wisdom. Ask him to help you to see things clearly, to understand things more deeply, to appreciate what's going on more carefully, to understand people and circumstances and situations and the present and the past and the future, that you'll ask God to help you to get a handle on what's really going on. That's a starting point. And the next step, I think, partly God's answer is to say, well, look to the place where I have demonstrated my wisdom above all else. And that place, of course, is in Jesus, in the death specifically of Jesus. What various people thought to be powerless, absolute weakness, foolishness, crass stupidity, God makes both wise and powerful. You see, it's in the death and the resurrection of Jesus that people can receive forgiveness, that you and I can be right with God. And friends, if we want to know real wisdom, then if we want to know God's thoughts, if we want to understand things from God's perspective, then we should pray and look to Jesus, because that's where true wisdom is to be found. It's interesting when you look at this little story that Solomon tells about the poor man saving the city, not by human might and strength, but in his weakness, he wisely saves the city. What do we see in Jesus? Well, we see one who was poor. didn't have a place at times to lay his head, depended on his Father in heaven for his daily bread. He lived an itinerant lifestyle. He didn't seem to have much going for him. He ended up being rejected, despised, beaten, tortured, killed by his own people. And that in that event, which seemed so foolish, you see the very power of God at work, a power to save. Have you come to Jesus? Do you know God's wisdom? Well, friends, the starting point is to come to Jesus. Why don't you do that?